Hey!
A very long time ago, nearly 400 years in the past, our town was officially colonized for the first time. The colonization of Pemaquid coincided with the rapid arrival of English fishermen and traders in the late 1500s. In the decades after Christopher Columbus accidentally landed in the Caribbean, there began a scramble to discover the New World. The exact year of first colonization varies somewhat, but most say it's in the 1620s. The first Europeans to ever come to Pemaquid came much earlier, though evidence of their arrivals is very scarce. 16th century fishermen from England were the first Europeans to take up any sort of permanent residence in Maine since the dawn of the millennium. Those early fishermen brought with them various English words, some of which would be learned by Samoset, a Native American chief who lived on Monhegan Island. Samoset was supposedly born in 1590 somewhere in Pemaquid, where he grew up and eventually became a leader. Native American chieftains were called Sagamores, or sachems. Much of Samoset's life is unknown. The lives of Native Americans were not entirely well documented. Many Europeans, up until the 20th century, referred to the Native Americans as savages. As such, details of their lives were seldom recorded. What we know of Samoset's story begins in the early 1600s, when fishermen from England had set up tiny fishing residences on the shores of Monhegan. Samoset, being a natural-born diplomat with a bold character, made good friends with the fishermen and captains that frequented his island. It was from them he learned to speak rudimentary English. It was broken, but it was enough to communicate. These English skills and boldness of character would prove absolutely crucial to the foundation of our entire nation. Samoset's world was quite a lot larger than you may think. Though the natives had no domesticated animals to take them about, they had vast waterways with great boats made of bark and extensive trail networks. Samoset was able to hitch a ride from Monhegan all the way to Massachusetts with an English ship captain to go see the Sagamore Massasoit. This tells you that the natives had social connections spanning much farther than you could walk on foot in a single day. The rich environments of America's Northeast fostered wide trade and diplomacy between the tribes. It was on a visit to Massachusetts in March 1621 when Samoset happened upon the colonists at the Plymouth plantation. The Pilgrims deeply feared the natives, and the natives, in turn, were cautious of the newcomers from across the sea. Though the Pilgrims suffered relentlessly in the unfamiliar land, the natives did not usually intervene. Samoset's visit was the first. He came to this hostile place nearly unarmed. He wore nothing but his loincloth and an empty quiver, a cultural gesture of peace. In his hand he carried 2 arrows, one tipped and one not, and he also had his bow with him. His hair was long and black, all the way down his back. The women and children screamed and ran. They had never seen something quite like this. Samoset was a massive man, much taller than the European settlers. Not only was he much taller than the tallest Englishman on the plantation, but he was naked. This surely startled the Pilgrims, who were shivering terribly in the cold March weather. What a terrifying beast of a man, they must have thought. Samoset walked proudly into the center of town and said, "Welcome, Englishmen, welcome." Any ears present were surely astounded, for no pilgrim had ever heard a savage speak English before this. Though they were fearful, Samoset had incredible warmth of character and quickly became friendly with the newcomers. Samoset's visit is described in Alexander Young's Chronicle of the Pilgrim Fathers. He very boldly came all alone and along the houses straight to the rendezvous, where we intercepted him, not suffering him to go in, as undoubtedly he would out of his boldness. He discoursed of the whole country, and of every province, and of their Sagamores, and their number of men and strength. He told the Pilgrims of another man they'd be interested to speak with, who knew much better English. Samoset later brought Squanto to the settlers, or Squanto as we know him today. Squanto was taken as a slave with other natives to Spain and England in years prior by a brutal man named Thomas Hunt. While in slavery, Squanto learned English and of English culture. He returned to America after some years in Europe, only to find that his entire family and village had been killed by disease. Squanto's devastating loss of family and home is most likely what caused him to be so amicable towards the Plymouth colony. Squanto was absolutely vital to the Pilgrims, as he helped them learn the best ways to fertilize soil in those first crucial years. Not only did he and Samoset educate them in growing food, but they also introduced the settlers to local chief Massasoit, who had an army of over 300 men. They helped to foster the very first diplomatic relations in the nation. Without these two, American history would have happened much differently. Samoset returned to Pemaquid sometime later. His story abruptly ends in most historical records after the introduction of Squanto to the Pilgrims. That is, until we get to 1625. There is a great myth surrounding the foundation of our town. It is widely propagated by many sources that Samoset sold 12,000 acres of land in 1625 to a fellow named John Brown for 50 beaver skins. It's not well known, but in the earliest days of Pemaquid's colonization, there were many land disputes going on. Some of those land disputes lasted hundreds of years, well into the Revolutionary period. As fanciful as it sounds, the massive land deed between John Brown and Samoset unfortunately never took place. The myth arose nearly 100 years later by descendants of John Brown in one of the many countless land disputes at the time. This does not mean that John Brown didn't exist and that he and the great Samoset didn't possibly have land deals together. Samoset supposedly sold what is today's Louds Island to John Brown, though it's not known for how much. Samoset is said to be buried on Louds Island as well. As it turns out, the Native Americans didn't really understand sale or ownership of land. They were hunter-gatherers that lived in a society of sharing and rough boundaries of tribal territory. Monetary exchange for land was quite alien to them. So how did we come to today? Most people are of the understanding that Pemaquid was sold to John Brown in 1625. It turns out that clever propaganda can last for a very long time if unchecked. From the late 1700s to the splitting of Maine from Massachusetts in 1820, the disputes for land were numerous, and it took decades for the fights to be resolved. The Brown deed with Samoset is one that slipped through the cracks, probably because it included such an influential character as Samoset. The political battlefield of early America was just as tumultuous as today's. That concludes today's story. I'd like to extend a personal thank you to local historian Pete Hope for helping me with this video. I'm glad you all stuck around to listen to the legend of Samoset and the mythical foundations of the town of Bristol. This episode took quite a lot of research to write, and I'm very happy I was able to put it all together like this. Thank you so much for watching.